Hi, I'm Deb Crow, and I want to welcome you to Season 3 of Imperfect, the Heart-Centered Leadership Podcast. This is a podcast where we connect, learn, and laugh together with authentic and courageous leaders from all over the globe. You will learn from leaders you haven't even met yet. You will gain new tools to add to your leadership toolkit. Leadership belongs to all of us. It's not measured by stature or title. So please pull up a chair and listen in. This is the Heart-Centered Leadership Podcast. It's interesting how you cross paths with people, and I have been watching both of these gentlemen for a number of months on LinkedIn. I've connected with them. I've commented on their post, and we've supported each other back and forth with different comments and support about all kinds of different elements to leadership. So I've invited them both on the show today. We have the founder and president of KeyneLink, Wayne Nelsen. And then I also invited Monte Pedersen, who is the principal of the CDA group. And these gentlemen combined together have decades of experience. We are going to talk all things leadership today, surrounded with heart-centeredness, of course. But some of the topics that they want to get into, I think you're really, really going to enjoy. So pull up a chair and help me welcome Wayne Nelsen and Monte Pedersen. Okay, so here we are. It's always fun to have two people on the podcast, especially when I know we're going to have some fun. So I've let the listeners know who you are and the name of your company. I'm going to let whoever wants to go first chime in. Tell our listeners a little bit about your story and how you two came about working together.
So you're waiting. So I guess I'm going first. All right. So I am Wayne Nelsen. I have a company called KeyneLink, and we formed KeyneLink at a point in time when we were really frustrated with working with strategy, and we created a company really just focused on managing execution within organizations. And Monty was actually a client of mine for a while, and at a point when he left that company, he called me up and said, Wayne, we were licensing things to outside consultants. And he said, hey, I want to get into this consulting thing. And that's kind of what started it. But what really started it was we did some work together when he was running one of the locations for a client that we had.
Yeah, and as I look back on that, Wayne, it was really the best decision of my life as I think about it. I mean, having gone through a full career of working in one industry with two major, corporate giants, getting out of that and then all of a sudden understanding that there is a better way to manage and lead people and effectively get results in your organization. I just spent a 38-year career and I didn't know it. So meeting Wayne was real a godsend just in terms of, putting light to what I had just kind of gone through and really what I wanted to do going ahead. So we sort of gathered around this idea of execution and, have been one of Wayne's principal consultants, but we've also kind of been doing some work in terms of trying to scale the organization and do some new things. So that's been exciting too.
Well, and my leadership questions are going to get into that, but I'll tell you what I love about this as the host of this show. My definition of heart-centered leadership is honoring your connection with people. And that's what you both did. And that's why you came together. And it's always fun when I get to interview two people. And as much as you've come together, you still have your own individual approach, your individual companies, your individual leadership, but they very much are connected and complemented each other. And that's why I was excited to have you both on the show. So I love that. Okay, 4 leadership questions are coming at you, and I'm going to let you banter back and forth, whoever wants to go first. Let's talk about leadership through the lens of execution. Now, Wayne, you alluded, you were working on strategy. There was a time you had to pivot as an entrepreneur, something we all do when we own companies. Share with us how you honed in on having the lens on execution and why you made that leap. And you both alluded that you're glad you did. What's been the biggest impression, or what have you noticed the most in the work you're doing?
The story for getting there was kind of intriguing. We're doing a lot of leadership development and strategy and strategic planning. And in all honesty, I would love to say this was all brilliant forethought. It's a whole lot of divine intervention. And the truth is, people laugh when I say this, but I created this company because I got irritated with a couple of clients. We did all this great work on strategy and strategic planning, and I had a couple of things just come together. I had gone and met with a client as a follow-up after, I think it was 4 or 5 months after we had spent a lot of time and a lot of work creating this strategy that everybody was all fired up and excited about. Went back and nothing had happened. Everybody got caught up in all the fires, and the normal thing had happened. This whole strategy is sitting on the shelf. And other than some financial goals and some sales goals, nothing was even really being tracked. It hadn't gotten through to the organization. And so I had that. And then I had another experience with, I was doing a lot of work with a client that was a defense contractor. And every year we were doing a strategy every year, but we did this annual thing where you go in and you do lessons learned, and then you start going into what the plan is for the following year. And I'm sitting in the room, and this was after that other meeting, a couple of days after. And I'm sitting in the room and listening to all these people kind of go back and forth as we're doing this thing on lessons learned. And they're bantering back and forth. They got into an argument on something. And I was just, don't do this as a consultant, but I was irritated, walked up to the front. I erased on this big whiteboard, it said lessons learned. I erased it, changed it to lessons collected, and turned around and said, hey, just pull the stuff out from last year because nothing really much has changed. And I walked out. And so that was the mood I was in, which, is not great. And we were sitting at dinner with my now ex-wife, but then my wife and partner, and we were talking about some of this stuff. And I was talking about how frustrated we were. And when we went into a client meeting the next day, I had a client ask me to create a performance appraisal for him. And I laughed and I said, no, we're not going. We're doing a lot of leadership development program. We had this 16-week long leadership development program that we were putting in place. He had just taken over this company. And he said, wait, I have to do a performance appraisal on my VP of Ops tomorrow. And what they have is terrible. And I laughed and said, Randy, good luck with that. It's like, I don't believe in performance appraisals at all. I'm not going to build you one. And he kept asking and pushing. He's like, well, all that stuff we're talking about leadership, there should be something in there. So all of a sudden we start talking about how we really should be working with employees. And now the leadership stuff, that all this stuff, because the old style performance appraisals from the 80s were, once a year, totally disconnected from everything. And most companies were doing it to check a box for HR. And that's what I didn't want to do. And we start talking about, well, how should the communication be? What should be in there? What should we be looking at? How do we get all that stuff that we're talking about in leadership in there? And really, if we're going to evaluate people's performance, it ought to be against, are we making progress on strategy? So we started talking this and putting this, and no one was talking about execution at the time. This is in December of 1999 when this conversation took place. So it was before Shram and Bosny wrote execution. So we didn't even have a name for this. And so I started getting excited as we're talking about, well, okay, yeah, we can make a change. We can develop something different. He's getting excited. And I walked out of his office. It was a Thursday night. I walked out of his office at like 8:00. And he said, hey, I got a company meeting on Monday morning. Just go put something together and let's roll it out. So I go home and tell my wife what I'd committed to do. And she was none too happy. And we spent the entire weekend building something totally from scratch, having no idea what we were going to do. And the reason I think the story is interesting is, had it happened a few years later when Google existed, I would have just Googled what everyone else was doing and tweaked some version of that and put it out. But we had to build this totally from scratch. And we didn't think anything of it. In all honesty, it's like we rolled it out. It was great. It had a whole bunch of holes in it. We fixed some holes and stuff. And then all of a sudden, other clients are asking. And then other consultants start asking, kind of what you're doing. And it went to 11 clients pretty quickly and had consultants coming in. And we had 21 consultants in a group one time wanting to know what it was that we were doing. And so I'm rolling all this out. And then the book comes out in 2003. And up until then, I was mistakenly calling this performance management. And the problem is that term sort of for a while got co-opted in performance management, sort of meant automated performance appraisals for a while. And when the book came out, when execution came out, it's like, wow, okay, that's what we're doing. And it really kind of took off from there, where all of a sudden I'm paying attention to that's the hole we always had in strategy. We create strategy, but we don't take it down to the frontline people. People don't understand really what's needed in there. We don't equip the leaders or the employees to make the changes needed to make to deliver on strategy. We always stayed focused just at the leadership team, and it didn't go further. So we ended up creating this whole process and calling it KeyneLink, which was it linked because it's a link between strategy and execution. And that took off when we started licensing it. And we got out of dealing with strategy for a long time. We're just now starting to touch some things related to strategy again. And I still to this day believe the biggest issue in business is execution. It's not strategy. We don't lack for ideas. Any manager out there knows what we're trying to get done. What we lack is how do we bring those ideas and changes all the way down to frontline workers? How do we get them involved? And I actually think, I know it's a little bit of a tangent, but when you talk to clients about what kind of problems and issues they have, we kept hearing the same things. They would say things like, we struggle with accountability or communication or employee engagement or leadership, this very big generic thing called leadership that everybody defines slightly different, which is why we're talking, right? But they seem to use a whole lot of words that if I lump them together, really come out to be symptoms sometimes of lack of execution. And then later in there, we were doing a lot of work with a couple of universities and stuff. And that's where Monte was working in a company that was actually doing work with universities. And it was great when he came on board. And we made a big difference in there. And then Monte, you and I met. And, when you left there, which I do agree, that was a great decision for you, by the way. We're having more fun out here. But it just kind of took off from there. So leadership and execution tie so tightly together, though. You cannot decouple them. You will never have execution without paying attention to leadership. And I actually think this is new thinking for me. But what Monte and I have been talking a lot about lately is that we really need to focus in organizations on developing leadership bench strength. I think there's three things that we really need to have. We need to have a structured methodology that's consistent for execution. And that needs to come into place first. And the reason I say that is the way we're approaching it, you're getting everyone involved and they're writing the goals and there's performance agreements and stuff. But when you get that structure in place, then in order to make that work, because of the way we have the progress meetings and stuff, leadership comes into play. And if you focus on execution, driving execution and having the systems and tools to manage execution, and you've got a strategic view that everybody's aligned and agrees on, and we focus on what I would call leadership bench strength in an organization, the outcome of focusing on those three gives you a performance culture, which I think is what all of us are looking for. But I think leadership bench strength is critically important. It's not just focusing on leadership. It's developing leadership capacity within the entire organization, throughout the organization. And too often when we talk leadership, people are just thinking of the title of people being in a management position or a leadership position. And leadership is so much more than that. If you're focused on leadership bench strength, then you start examining things like, how good are we as an organization at actually developing leaders internally? Because especially with small companies, I don't think we think about that at all. I think they think in terms of let's go hire people with leadership skills, but we should also be focusing on how do we develop leaders internally and how do we grow them? And that should be that needs to be a strong focus, and it's not. And one of the questions I ask, and it's a cliche question, right? But one of the questions I always ask people is, how comfortable are you in any leadership position? How comfortable are you leaving the company on vacation for a month and having no contact? How nervous does that make you? And in small companies, we've got people saying they can't even go on vacation for 3 or 4 days. So we don't have the leadership bench strength to grow the organization. So that's kind of where we're focused right now.
It's interesting because you talk about this benchmark. And in the work that I do in my heart-centered leadership model is people really get stuck with this extrinsic value. And you said it so beautifully, and I didn't want to interrupt you. The title doesn't matter. It's the foundation of the action and then having the discipline. And it doesn't really matter what the title is. And you're right. There's a huge lack of vision and clarity. And people get stuck, literally boots stuck in the mud with strategy. And such a great story. And I can see your frustration of changing the words on the whiteboard and walking out to say, just go back to what you did last year. It's another big element that I think we're seeing in business is people are so over-focused on the wrong things, and then it affects how they listen or lack thereof. So, Monte, I want you to chime in here because I'd love to hear kind of your lens of execution and what you've seen, if you want to add on to anything that Wayne just alluded to.
Yeah. So we share this this feeling and understanding that in order to be able to lead people effectively, you have to be able to manage them at an individual level. And Wayne mentioned performance agreements, which are, when you talk about heart-centered leadership, well, the performance agreements is at the heart of what it is, Keyne Insight does. And so most organizations feel like they can't manage people at an individual level. They can't write customized goals that are really unique to their gifts and talents. And nobody really even tries. And one of the reasons they don't try is because it's a heck of a lot of work. And it takes a heck of a lot of courage for you to sit down as a manager with a direct report and kind of get them to open up and talk about what it is that you do well and tell them what they don't do well and figure out what the role requires and what the organization is looking for. So you just kind of have this, this nail biting, type of activity that people don't like. But in reality, if you're going to execute well, you've got to have people managed at an individual level. You've got to be able to work with them, collaboratively develop an agreement with them in terms of what their primary job responsibilities are and what their goals are for each year, and make sure that they align not only with their peers and everybody in their circle of influence, but to the level above them and the level above them. So ideally, you want people knowing why they contribute to their department, key initiative, whatever they need to accomplish that year. You want them contributing to that so that it multiplies and goes on up and helps the organization achieve its strategic objectives. So it really does come down to knowing your people and investing and developing your people so that they can be their best in order to help the organization.
And I think the link to that, kind of going back to what Wayne said, that's where titles are important. Because look, in the last decade, how many CHROs have cropped up in companies, VP of People and Culture, Chief Heart Officer. I mean, Gary Vee took that off when he put Claude Silver in there. And that's all she does is ask those tough questions and looks after, 1,000+ employees. But the beauty is when she meets with them a year later, it's a much different conversation. So it's like having that person always readily there with maybe a talent management or HR background, but the people-centric, heart-centered approach. I'm even seeing Chief Purpose Officer now cropping up. And again, there's similarities among titles and roles and responsibilities, but those are the people that you need to get to the level that you're talking about, Monte, so that they can report back to get to what the higher leader ups want to get to. So I find it fascinating. Okay, I'm moving on to my second question. It has permanent residency on the show. I've asked over 220 leaders this question. Tell me, both of you, we'll let you go first this time, Monte. What imperfections do you bring to your heart-centered leadership?
You name it. When I knew I was going to be on this program, I said, you know what, I'm perfect for this because I got a heck of a lot of it. So I think the hardest thing is just looking at things with a level of emotional intelligence, right? It's like, not judging people, trying to put yourself in their shoes, having humility, understanding, where people are and dealing with them, from a place that, you understand they're at, and then helping them succeed. So, for me, it's kind of forgetting about how I used to manage people in the corporate world and really, looking at it just from a completely different perspective, which is, okay, we're here now. This is what we're trying to do. We've got to move forward. How do we do that? How can we work together to make this, as effective as possible? And so for me, it usually just boils down to empathy and humility and candor and just doing those things that I didn't do a lot of in my previous career.
And from an imperfection standpoint, are you patient or impatient?
That is one of my attributes. I am fairly patient.
That's a frequent flyer on the show, so I thought I'd throw it in. How about you, Wayne?
Oh, I'm absolutely impatient. That's why we work together. So the issues that I run into in leadership is at times I'm way too much of a visionary. So we come up with these great ideas. I throw all these ideas out, and it's that stereotypical visionary thing where it's like, I may put 4 or 5 things up on the whiteboard as we're talking and send everybody out. I've got a clear idea of what we're doing, but there might have been 5 years worth of activity in what I just laid out. And I just had this happen last week. I walked in and somebody was working on something, and I said, "Why are you working on that now?" And they said, "Well, because you said, in our staff meeting, you said you wanted to know this." Well, yeah, I didn't mean that for another year. I know we can't get there now. And here they'd spent 2 days actually trying to figure something out. That's a long-term thing. So I don't do a good job of communicating that. When you get these visionary ideas and I'm not great at breaking that down into detail. You can make them happen, but getting them broken down to a point where it's actually manageable and allowing people to come along for that ride. So what it causes is it causes them sometimes to feel like they're not accomplishing what I'm looking for because they're not making the steps fast enough. And I didn't expect that. And I don't communicate it well enough. And then on the short-term things, the reason that's a problem is because on the short-term things, I would call it impatient. And I think other people would probably call it impatient. I don't think that's what it is. I think I get very excited about something, so I want to get it done now, and it comes across as impatience.
I think that's every entrepreneur and business owner on the planet, right? I'll join you guys there. Okay, my third question. We've been talking about execution and strategy. Let's kind of shift to culture for a minute. When we look at culture and values and behavior, give us an overview of how that influences the strategy.
You want to take this one first?
Maybe share with the listeners kind of a Cole's notes, give us like a top 3 kind of strategy approach, because I know we could do a whole show on this. So what's top of mind, Monte, to start us off with this?
Yeah. Well, you have to tie your culture and your values back to your strategy. And that's something that a majority of senior leaders and CEOs have a problem doing, because if you can't keep those things top of mind inside your organization, then basically whatever happens, and you'll largely live by what we call a default culture. It's just whatever you're willing to tolerate gets accepted. So I would say one of them is definitely being able to live your culture and to be able to continually keep it top of mind with your people, discuss it. In the KeyneLink system, we have core behaviors, and culture is a foundational element. So we understand the importance of that. And I think sometimes, Wayne, we even struggle with having it visible enough.
I would agree with that. And I think culture and values are really important to me. And I think there is a lot of confusion around it. My belief, which I don't think is the popular belief, but my belief is that we shouldn't be focused on changing culture, because culture is an outcome of other things that you do. Culture is the outcome of how we lead, how we manage, how we train people, how well we're communicating with. All of those are subsets of leadership, getting them engaged. I think the culture is an outcome of how clear is the direction and what kind of feedback are you giving to people, and how's that leadership dynamic actually working? Values do come into this, and I think there's confusion on culture, because I'm not a fan of where they're doing culture surveys or even engagement surveys. I'm just not a big fan of that, because I think you start asking questions and you get people thinking about it, and we're doing the wrong thing. We're trying to move a number on some sort of an engagement survey instead of really paying attention to what do we do. If there are cultural issues, we shouldn't be focused on culture. We should be focused on the leadership or the management or the communication or the strategy or whatever else it is that is miscommunicating to people. Because if we have problems with culture, that's what it's about in my mind. And if you tie values into that, then I think it actually gets more confusing. In the very beginning, when we first created this whole process, there's a whole section in this that we call foundation, which is vision, mission, core behaviors, all the core values, all the normal stuff that you would have. And we had core values in there. And it occurred to me at one point, because what we're really doing is bringing everything down to an individual level. When we're talking execution, it happens at an individual level. What individuals in an organization do or don't do, what they get done or don't get done, is what determines whether or not we ever actually achieve strategic initiatives. So it has to be brought to that level, and we don't do it traditionally. We haven't done a very good job of that. And that's why we created this thing called a performance agreement, which is this collaborative partnership between a manager and an employee, where there's a conversation and the employees entering goals and primary job responsibilities from the conversation, and it's an agreement between the two of them. But to give context to the goals, you have to have you've got to know what the company is about. So you have to have the strategy, and you have to have the core values. And core values are really important. But to me, core values are about beliefs and aspirations of the organization. That's hard to manage individuals from. Those are statements like, we believe in this, we believe we are this, we believe in these things. Fantastic things to gauge, are we headed that way? But very hard to manage from. Core behaviors at an individual level, and in terms of influencing culture, I believe core behaviors are much more important than core values. And getting to core behaviors, and the reason I think there's confusion is I think there's been this mix. For a while, there was confusion even amongst, I would see people with a list of core values. Some of them are values, some of them are behaviors, some of them are competencies. And it's not that I'm being a purist, but core values have a very specific place in defining what an organization stands for and what they're about and the impact that they're going to have. That's not necessarily meant to manage individuals. And I think in too many organizations, we don't go deep into core behaviors. Core behaviors become minimal behavioral standards within an organization. And that gets to what we tolerate, what we accept, what we reward, because that's things like productivity and resilience and resourcefulness and all of those behaviors that make somebody great within that particular organization. And all of those are changeable and coachable. And if you're focused on that, and we're delivering on initiatives, and we've got a clear strategy in front of us, and we've got the performance agreements, which include we're having progress meetings once a month and sitting down and talking about how we're doing, the outcome of that is culture. And if I just focus on culture, I find too many people are focused on the wrong things. We get core behaviors in place. We get very clear expectations and goals with people. We set up a structure where you're communicating often with employees from a standpoint of what's going well, what are you proud of, what do you need help with, so that real, what we all know is leadership now, not leadership of the past. If we do all of those things, the outcome then is this culture that we're all looking for? So it's a real hot button for me.
Well, but you really well done in the way you explained it, because people can convey a language regardless of where they are in the organization, and culture almost gets slanted with that extrinsic, materialistic. The culture is the culmination of everything you just said. And when you peel away everything, it's people-centric. But if you don't have everything in that specific order, that sequence, you can't start at the culture and work backwards. It's well said. Well said. Again, we could have a whole other conversation on that, but I like the way that you broke it down. And I also wanted to say, when you were talking about being a vivid visionary, there's so many brilliant minds out there. And when they can't come back and just seed all those great ideas and wrap some discipline and structure around them, there's so much wasted great intuitiveness, intention, and the excitement's there and the clarity's there. But again, going back to values and behavior, if you don't have the structure or the discipline, nothing's going to move the needle forward. So I'm just going to put a big stop there because that was so well done. Okay, I'm going to switch to my Fab Four because I knew this was going to be a long, good conversation. 4 fun questions, just so our listeners, which are in 65 countries now, and I get goosebumps every time I say that. I'm going to ask a question. I don't want you to think about it. It's those top of mind answers. So Monte, if I asked your family or your friends to describe you in one word, what would it be?
Probably sarcastic.
Oh, I like that. Okay.
Yeah.
Wait, how about you?
Enthusiastic.
Enthusiastic. Well, you guys compliment each other. I love that. So I know if I'm going to be engaged with you guys, there's going to be some sarcasm with a little bit of integrated enthusiasm. That's hilarious. Okay, wait. Name a book. You could have read it at any juncture in your life. What's the name of the book and the author, and why was it impactful for you?
There's actually 2. Execution is one because it gave a name to what we're doing now and kind of forced, it put a name to this and validated what we're doing and sent this on a path. There's another book by Stephanie Winston that I read in the 80s called The Organized Executive, which still has some of the best organizational, I don't even know if that's still out, but it had some of the best organizational stuff, which I am so weak at.
I love that. I love that. And I love that Monty's looking over at his bookshelf going, which one should I pick while Wayne's talking? So, Monty, which one is it?
And here's the funny thing about it. I've read this book twice. I can't remember the title, but it's a book that I got referenced from your neighbor and our connection, David McLean. And it's I think it's the 15 elements of conscious leadership, the conscious leadership group. Correct me if I'm wrong on the title, but David referred that to me probably 3 or 4 years ago. And it's just, and this is what he called it. It's just one of those books that puts it all together for you, managing above or below the line. And it's just such a simple management model that I've taken away from that I share it often with clients and with friends and other people I talk to because it just makes so much sense. And so living by those 15 elements, and it's not as complicated as it sounds, but just the whole concept of being a conscious leader, is a great thing. So that book for sure.
And doing that with simplicity, that sounds like a great book. I know the book you're talking about, and I think that's what it's called. Okay, I'm granting you both a wish, and it's going to be really interesting to hear the answer to this. So let me put some context around the wish. You get to have dinner with a leader of your choice. Now, this leader could be living or maybe they've passed. Who is the leader, and what is the dinner conversation? Wayne, you go first.
Wow. Probably the person I would most love to have dinner with would be Abraham Lincoln. That was an awful lot to manage his way through. and just to know how he thought his way through what he had to deal with.
He has been named on the show quite a bit, actually. I wanted to let you know that. So that's really interesting. And that's basically the answer that some of the leaders have shared. And it, kind of awestruck to look back in history, right? Monte, who's the leader that you're having dinner with, and what's the dinner conversation?
Yeah, this is going to throw you for a curve probably, but I would say Paul McCartney.
Oh.
And the reason why is, here's this guy, and I think he's like 74 or 75 now, but he's been playing music since he's been like 14 or 15 years old. He's been doing what he loves, and he continues to do it. And I saw him. I took my son to one of his concerts when he was 71, and I was so impressed because here's this guy up there, and he sang for 2 full hours before he took one break. And then it was just a short break, and he came back and sang for another hour. And it's like, that's how I want to live. And I guess the dinner conversation would focus on, what's your secret? How did you find, this, and how it gave you so much joy that you just wanted to do it all the time? I mean, I think that's what a lot of people would be interested in, in knowing if they could go back and be granted a wish, and, it would help me to find my gift a lot sooner than I found it.
Well, and I like that that's your choice, because he's had such longevity and he's still so vibrant in his 70s, because there's other artists in their 70s who are still trying to do it and they're not as vibrant. And some of them have done their last tour, yet, they continue to crop up for more last tours. But the other thing about him is he's endured so much trauma and hurt along the way and loss. And he's just very gracious. And I think music is such a universal language that kind of integrates us as a global society as a whole. And that would be a great conversation. That would be a fun dinner for sure, Monte. Well, I knew this conversation was going to be good, and I'm glad we kind of gave some inroads to strategy versus execution. So I'm so glad that we got to get together. I look forward to following your leadership online and keeping in conversation once in a while. And I'm going to ask you both to finish the show by finishing this sentence for me. And I'd like to hear what you both would say for this. So my last question is, heart-centered leadership is?
Heart-centered leadership is all about your people. And in fact, in general, leadership is about everybody else but you. As a leader, you're there to elevate their success. And if you're not doing that, then you're not leading. You're a boss, or you're a manager, or you're dictating what people need to do. So without question, heart-centered leadership is human-centric. It's about leading your people and doing what's in their best interest so that they do what's in your best interest in return.
Heart-centered leadership is about building and growing people. And what I mean by building is heart-centered leadership is really, to me, about taking your people where they are and growing them from that. It's not the measure. I heard somebody say this one time, which it always kind of stuck with me, is the measure of a leadership or the measure of a good leader is not what they're doing right now. It's where are all the people on your team 5 years and 10 years from now? What have you grown them into? What have you turned them into? And, it's sort of like I've always looked at it. Sports isn't always a perfect analogy, but it's not in sports. It's not the team staffed with all the superstars that always win. It's the team with the best leaders that can get more out of the team than they even thought, and pulling them together and growing them. And I think that's the magic. And to me, heart-centered leadership is meeting people where they are now and helping them to grow and build them over a period of time. And the test is, where are your people 5 years from now and 10 years from now?
Thanks for joining me today on Imperfect, the Heart-Centered Leadership Podcast. I hope that you've enjoyed the show today and learned some new tools for your leadership from our amazing heart-centered guest. And if if you like the show, we would welcome a rating and review on whatever platform you listen to. And we would love to have any comments or feedback at any time. And if you want some more heart-centered goodness, head over to our daily blog, masteringtheheart.com.